All right. Today we are going to do at least two things. Number one, we are going to put some air trapping, some validation and some air trapping in our example that we did last time. Or we'll talk about validation. I don't know if I'll actually put validation because you should have a pretty good idea how that works by now, and you should be able to do it. But I am going to talk about air trapping. So in case there's an error, what do you do? Especially looking for in case there's an error that you couldn't necessarily anticipate, or like I said before, it's just too big of a hassle to try to test for. So you let the error happen, and then you write code to handle the error gracefully so it doesn't blow up. So let's bring down what we had from last time and take a quick look at it. I'll honestly tell you, I haven't felt that exhilarated in a long time when I finally figured out the problem I was having Thursday or Tuesday, because that was really like, what is going on here? And what was tough is we did find a couple of the typos that I made, but when we finally found the parameter bit, it was like, yes. So, let me download this. Oops. I'm going to set the login page as my start page. A couple of things. Ideally, you would build a navigation system into your pages. It's probably a little late for me to tell you that now. And therefore, it would have been good if you did a master page for the first one, even though I haven't done one explicitly for this. And if you did a master page, good for you. All right, I'll give you extra practice with it. And plus, you can then put a navigation. So like if I have to go bounce from page to page, it's easy. I'm going to set as the start the login page. That way I don't have to worry every time, because today we're going to be focusing on maintaining these tables, and therefore I want to make sure that you're logged in first. So we've tested that last time, that we can't get to the code to maintain it if we're not logged on. So we know that works. So I might mention it briefly, but other than that, we're not going to focus on that. So I go to log in. I type in my username and password correctly, I hope. Log in. I can add a pizza. And we can give a name to the pizza and the image name. We're really going to just focus on the name of the pizza. So I'm going to type in, we're going to have a Polish pizza. What do you think would be on a Polish pizza?
Delicious sausage and
pierogies. Sausage and pierogies, yes. I like that.
Yes.
I was thinking cabbage and noodles, but I'm not really a big cabbage fan. So we'll go with potato pierogies and kielbasa on top of a pizza. Oh man, that sounds good.
Yeah.
I click add. And there you go. It's on the list. All right.
So it is.
Now, what can go wrong? A couple things can go wrong. Number one, name is a required field. So if I go in here and try to save a pizza without a name, it's going to blow up. The insert fails. And there's a specific kind of exception that happened. All right? An OLE DB exception was unhandled by the code. So that's not good because we're not handling the exception. Remember that when there's an error that occurs, I'm saying remember, I don't know if we've talked about this at all yet, so maybe this is the first time we're going over it. But if an error occurs, an exception occurs, someone has to handle it. All right? And there's two choices, you or the .NET framework. All right? So your code's either going to handle it or the .NET framework's going to handle it. The .NET framework is not going to handle it in a pretty way. All right? Let's do that again and let's look at the error message. I canceled out too quickly here. Let's go and look at the error message that the .NET framework gives. So I can click that, and I click that. I'm going to go and click continue. And it gives me this error, which there's a couple things wrong with this error. All right. First of all, this would be very intimidating for a user. They're liable to not have any idea what that means. All right. Maybe they could figure it out, but it's certainly not very user-friendly, and it's certainly not obvious what they need to do to correct the error. All right. That's one of the things that you want to do when you give an error message is, give the user an idea of what happened. Let them know, for example, that it didn't save the data. All right? And then let them know what they need to do to correct it. All right? And let them know in plain English. All right? Now, behind the scenes, you could log an error and so on. All right. Now, there's a couple other things wrong with this error message. First of all, normally, we're seeing this error message because we're in development mode. All right, we're running this on our own local web server because we're the developers working on this. So we see this message, which is good because it'll help us debug and figure out what's wrong. If this was on an actual web server, if this was in production, you would give the user an even vaguer error message, or .NET would give the user an even vaguer error message. The reason for that is this actually divulges a little piece of information about our system. All right? What does this tell potentially a hacker about our system? It tells them the name of a table. All right? It tells them that there is a table named Specialty Pizza. So they could then possibly try a SQL injection attack and get rid of that table and wreak havoc on our system. So that's why .NET by default will not give specific error messages when it's in production mode. All right, it'll give a vague error message saying, something went wrong. Too bad for you. I don't know if it actually says that, but more or less it says that. So you don't want your users to see this message. All right, because it divulges some information about the system. So you don't want the users to see this kind of error message. So the error message that you would be given would be even vaguer, would even be harder for people to figure out. Okay, so what can we do? Well, obviously, we can go in and we can put a validate control on it. All right, so the solution of this one is easy. I can go in and drag a validator over, required field validator, put that there, configure it, error message must enter name, can make the display dynamic, that way it won't take up the space. The control to validate is going to be that first text box name, and so on. So So now we got that error covered. So if I go and log on, try and add a pizza, and save it without entering anything, we get an error.
Wow. Wonder why.
I wonder why too. Let's go check our work. Required field validator. Must enter name. Control to validate text box name. Display dynamic. This error, okay? I don't know why I didn't give us this first time. We remember this one, don't we? Yes, this is the one that you should go and you should copy some code from one of my web config files. Let's see which one. All right. This time it should work. Now we get our error. So that problem is easy enough to fix. All right. We have another problem now that we could talk about how we could fix it, but then we're going to say, you know what, there's going to be an easier way. All right. What if we add in a duplicate name? So the Polish pizza was so good we try to enter it twice. I go and hit save. Boom. We get an error. All right. Why did we get an error?
Because that field's supposed to be unique.
Right, because we set a unique index on that field. Remember, that's sort of common to do when you have something that's a candidate key. What's a candidate key? A candidate key is a field that fits all the requirements for a primary key. In other words, the name of the pizza should be unique, right? Because you don't want two California pizzas on the menu because someone orders a California pizza. You want to make sure they get the right thing, right? There shouldn't be two choices. So you should give them different names. So that should be unique. So in other words, strictly speaking, we could use that as a primary key. All right? But we didn't. And why didn't we? Well, a few reasons. One reason is that numbers are easier to store in databases than characters are. Numbers take up less space. So because that's a primary key, it's going to be stored as the foreign key in other tables. Therefore, it's better to store it numerically. So again, if we look at the specialty pizza table, go into design view and look at that specialty pizza name, it is set to be indexed and allow no duplicates and be required. All right? So you have to enter something in, and it has to be unique. Now, there's a couple ways we could fix this problem, because obviously we don't want those ugly errors popping up. All right? We don't want this ugly error popping up. Essentially, it would look the same way as it did before. Like that. The change you requested to the table was not successful because they would create duplicate values to the index, primary key, or relationship. Change the data in the field or fields that contain the duplicate data, remove the index, or redefine the index to permit duplicate entries and try again. Wow, you definitely don't want to show a user that error, right? I know what it means, and it's a hard time understanding what it means, right? So therefore, you'd want to put a nice user-friendly error. Or maybe we could put some validation in there. Well, if you think about it, there's no validation control for this, right? All the validation controls that we have are JavaScript. In other words, they're very simplistic. In other words, we validate that there's something in the field. We validate that it's a number. We validate it's a date. We validate that it's within a range. We compare it to another field on the page. There's no validation to say, is there something in the database that already has this value? All right? Mainly because client-side code, JavaScript, doesn't access databases. All right? So there's no validation to say, hey, check to see if this is in the database. Well, we could write our own, and we could write our own on the server side. So one thing that we could do, the way that we could handle this, is I could put code right about here, or here, that read out and did a query and checked to see, similar to what we did with the user ID and password when we logged on. We could create our object, we could create a select statement, we could run out, we could execute the query, see if there's any pizzas that have that as their name. If there is, then we could set a label. If not, we could go ahead and try to do the insert. So we could do that. But I'm not going to. Why? Because that's a pain, all right, to write code like that. I mean, it's not that hard, but keep in mind, we want to be able to catch any error that occurs, all right? And this particular thing of a duplicate index is one of but many errors that could potentially occur. I won't go and create them all, but the database could get renamed. Someone could rename a table or a column. So a statement that worked last week doesn't work today because someone changed something in the database. For other types of database, the database server could have crashed and is down. That's totally out of our control as developers. There's no way we can simply write code to handle situations like that. All right? So what we're going to do is we're going to let it try to insert no matter what the data is. All right? Other than the empty field, because the empty field we can validate simply enough. All right? Remembering that the database constraints are a catch-all. So if later on they go and they make the image name required, we don't have to handle any code. All right? We don't have to add any code to it. All right? Because we're going to catch any error that happens. How do you catch errors within the C# language? With a try-catch.
Try-catch.
All right. What does a try-catch do? A try-catch goes out, tries to run the statements. If it encounters an error, it generates what's called, or throws, is the proper terminology, an exception. The catch part grabs that exception and does something with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap our insert into a try-catch block. We'll talk in a minute here about like what operations you would put in a try-catch block. All right? But I've definitely got to put the insert statement in there. So I'm going to say try this statement. We are like at the exact same point in my Java class. So this is fresh on my mind. It doesn't like my E. Because it's already a variable named E. So I'm going to call it exe. And it's warning me that I'm not using it. That's fine. We're not using it now. That shouldn't be in the catch block. It should be up here. And if there's an error, I'm going to be real simplistic for now and simply make a label that says that there's an error. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Not getting the properties over there. You can always go and check the list of properties, which is not showing me. Or I can go in the code view. And I can call it label error. And I'm going to set the text as an empty string. So if there's a problem, I'm going to label error dot text equals error. I'm going to save this because I don't think the code behind knows about the label yet. I don't know, I'm going to try running it. All right, there we go. I don't know what's going on here. Username is just Mike, that's right. Now if I add something in here that's a duplicate, it's going to, should display in the label. And we'll talk more about that in a second. Alright, there it is. It says it's an error. Okay. Not the best error message, but at least we didn't get the blow up ugly error message.
Indeed.
So let's look at how this works. Again, what happens is these statements will be attempted. If there's any errors, that is, any exceptions generated, then the code that catches those exceptions will go and handle them. How many of you have done try catches before? Okay, you all have, all right? I'm catching specifically, or I'm actually not catching specifically for any error. I'm looking for any exception. All right? You can actually fine-tune this if you want to and look for certain exceptions and either display a different error message or take a different strategy in doing that. So I could actually do this. If I remember the name of the exception, I think it was something like Ole DB dot and I could actually catch a specific exception and say database error. This is so weird.
Just to do that so buggy lately.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Well, anyhow, at least theoretically, you could catch different exceptions and then do something different. All right? We talk about, in a lot of classes, just displaying like an error message if you get an exception. And with interactive programs where like you're running something that's on a on a screen that has a UI associated with it, that's probably what you're going to do a lot of the time. All right? But depending on the kind of application, there might be other things that you might do too. You could default values, for example, or you could force return values. The one example I thought of yesterday when I was talking to my Java class is, let's say you were looking at credit applications, and there was some data that was erroneous. My guess would be that they would just return that the credit application was declined and maybe put an explanation saying that there was an error with the data, correct the data, and reapply, or something like that. All right? But again, it all depends on the particular application that you're working on. And for our purposes, we're just going to display an error message. instructions generate an error, then the catch exception will catch it and grab it. Now our error message is pretty inadequate, right? Because all we say is error, all right? What I would do if I was writing an error message would be, I would put likely causes, all right? Because just about any database exception, any exception that you're going to get in this case is going to be that OLE DB database exception. One thing I could do is I could concatenate onto the end of the message, if I wanted to, the actual message from the exception. All right? And that gets the message that we had before. Again, is that something we want to show the user? I don't know. All right? We might, like in this case, where it is sort of only for site administrators can get into this page. In other words, the general public doesn't get to this page. It might be okay to display a message as thorough as this, because you might say on the end of it, contact your ID department and tell them the database or the message was this. All right? So in this particular case, since this is not meant for the general public, displaying a complete error message like this might be okay. It doesn't mention any table names or anything like that. It just in general gives us something that probably is pretty common sense, that one of these fields has to be unique. So probably the name has to be unique. All right? The other thing that you could do, so that would be one possibility, that exception that gets thrown has properties that tells information about about actually what happened, and you can display one of those, probably the message. You can also do something like put in user terms what the likely cause is. Perhaps duplicate data. Perhaps database is down for maintenance. I would say these are the two things that would be most likely wrong in this scenario, right? We know what the problem is, right? So we know that that is duplicate data. But the other possibility would be, especially with other kinds of database management systems, the other possibility would be that the database is down for maintenance. So I'm going to put it, and I'm going to express it in user-friendly terms. I'm not going to simply display the system message.
I'm going to get rid of the plus sign.
Oh, I got to get rid of the plus sign. Thank you. So we'll get that error message. And we give a description. And they can look back and say, you know, if we really wanted to at that point, we could do a query. All right? Now that we know that there's an error, it might be okay to say, hey, there's already a duplicate thing called veggie ID or veggie pizza, and here's the data about it. We could do that if we wanted to. The idea of checking for a duplicate every time adds database operations for every time someone adds one, even if they know that it's brand new pizza and it's unique. But again, this in general are sort of the strategies you can take to prevent errors. You can either put validation code in there to keep the errors from happening, or you can let the thing get an error, let the SQL statement get an error, and then catch the error and do something with it and handle it. And since we handle it, the framework doesn't have to handle it, and we can handle it however we want to. Again, that will depend on the specific problem that you're talking about. And in a web page like this, typically, probably the best that you can do is display a user-friendly error message. Questions about this? Questions? Okay. Now, what was I going to go to? Oh. We can actually, if we want to, use a details view to do the inserting for us. Remember, there's always, not always, but there's frequently a couple alternatives to most of the things you do in .NET. You can use the stuff that's in the framework, or you can write your own code. In this case, we wrote our own code. Why did we write our own code? Well, because this user ID comes from the session variable, and it's just as easy to write our code because we have to insert that anyhow. What works for a details view is when you have a case of, what was I going to say here? When you have a case of all the data is entered manually. The user ID is not something that's entered manually. Therefore, it's best just to write code to force it in. And there might be other ways to do this as well, but this is the way that we took. I'm going to go and add to, what's on our default page? Our default page shows a list of toppings. Excellent. I'm going to create an add toppings page. And I am going to use a details view to implement that. All right, so I'm going to jot down the names of these variables. So there's a topping name, description, and calories. And the table, I believe, is called toppings. All right. So I'm going to go and new file, web form. We'll call add toppings. Place code in a separate file. I wish I had a master page, but I don't. I'm going to put a details view and I'm going to put a SQL data source. All right? I'm going to configure the data source, and I'm going to do that just as we've always done with one addition. All right? Go pick my connection. Next. I'm going to pick toppings. Pick everything from toppings. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do a custom SQL statement. Never mind. My select statement is going to say select star from toppings. And that's all I'm going to say. All right? Interestingly enough, the select statement is not going to be really used for this one. Why is it not going to be used? Because we're not going to be using this page to retrieve, at least right now, we're not going to be using this page to retrieve a particular topic. We're going to be using this to add topics. All right? So we're not going to start off with a list of toppings. We're going to just do that. But still we need a select statement. We can't get by without one. I can then put an insert statement on here. And this is where I'm going to write my insert statement. Insert into toppings. I'll put my columns. Topping name. Description. And calories. Values. Now, this is interesting. So I hit next. Normally, we're used to seeing a dialog popping up saying where the question marks get their values from. That's when there's question marks in a select statement. This is an insert statement. So it's smart enough to know where the values are going to come from because this is going to be connected to a details view. So when we connect it to the details view, it's going to say, oh, I get it. The field in the details view for topping name, that's going to go in the topping name. The field for description is going to go in the description. The field for calories is going to go into calories. So it's actually smart enough to know that. All right. I'm going to hit next. Again, notice we didn't get that dialog that asks us where those question marks are going to come from. That's only with the select statement. Test query. All right. That works. And finish. So we have our grid view, and we have our, details view, and we have our SQL data source. You can't insert into a grid view easily. All right. Almost always, if I say you can't do something, in your mind, add the word easily on the end of that, because you can do a lot of stuff. All right, is that you would have to do a lot of custom coding to make that work. By default, you can't insert into a grid view. Now, I have to do another thing. I have to bind this here. And I have to tell the grid view that I want to be able to insert into this. All right. So remember, we always have these two objects when we're doing database interactivity. We have this data source, the object that is tied to the database. Then we have the UI object, that is the user interface. If we want to add functionality, or if we want to change something, let's talk about adding functionality. We have to make changes in both places. We have to configure the data source to allow inserting. How do we do that? By putting in an insert statement. We then have to tell the details view, okay, it's cool to insert. And we do that by checking enable inserting. All right. Okay. Now let's run this and see what happens. I am going to create a link. Actually, I'm going to change login. To redirect to add toppings when it's done. Instead of list. Oh, and the other thing I should do, I should copy that code that is in the page load event. So that if they're not logged on, they can't go in and add toppings. All right. So now I'm going to run this. I go and log on. I'm now going to get directed to the Add Toppings page. It shows me an existing topping now. Well, that's weird, but, well, we did have a select statement. All right, so I guess that's okay. So this is the first topping. All right. I don't want to do anything with this, though. I want to go and create a new one. So I click New. And I get topping name, description, and calories. Why didn't I get toppings ID? Yeah, that's an auto number field. We don't enter that in. It's automatically generated. So I go and I type in a new topping. This just came to my mind, zucchini.
Okay.
That sounds disgusting.
Indeed.
Yuck. And 30 calories. I'm going to click Insert. Huh. It went back to the first one. Did it add it? I don't know. We didn't get an error. It probably added it. So I'm going to go to the default page and see if it added zucchini. And it didn't.
So how about that?
I'm going to look at the code real quick to see if I can figure out what's going on here.
You know, eggplant's very tasty on pizza.
I'll keep that in mind.
Did we need to insert a value for the?
No.
Okay.
No, it automatically creates. Remember, we talked about that last time. It automatically generates the value for the ID. It does not need to be in the insert statement. Okay, values, question mark, question mark, question mark. Insert into toppings. This is why it's useful to be able to read the code. I think I know what's wrong, but I'm not 100% sure. Here's what I'm going to do.
What?
All right. I'm going to jump ahead to something I want to cover in a couple minutes. So we'll go a little bit out of sequence, but this will hopefully help me get my figure out what's wrong. All right. Let me try this. Okay, it's connecting those. Let me actually look in the Access database to verify that it is not being saved and there's a problem elsewhere. It is adding them. It's just not displaying it on that screen.
Huh.
It's
Where?
also not showing some of the other things that were in there. Like
Sure.
pineapple wasn't showing up. I don't think ham was showing up either.
Okay. Well, good debugging tip. Don't assume something's correct. In other words, that page was not showing everything, and I wonder why that is. Let's go and look at that page. Where calories are less than 10. Oh my God. I'm going home. That's it.
All right then.
I changed that to show only where calories are less than 10. Okay. All right, there we go. And now if we go into default, it will show it correctly. This is where I need a professional video editing staff, because they would just go in and cut that right out of the video, all right? And you people that got to see it live would know what really happened. Okay, so I go and add a new one, and I add eggplant, which I've heard is very good. Makes sense, eggplant parmesan, right? It's almost like that.
Have you ever been to Lorenzo's? You can get the
Oh,
eggplant
yeah.
pizza.
Uh-huh.
It's basically fried eggplant, and then they put it on the pizza.
Sounds good. Insert, and then there we go. Where is the refresh button? Yeah, I heard someone say that, and it's like, you are reading my mind.
Should be there.
Can you just hit F5?
Thank you. Okay, that's getting the error because I tried to insert it again, but anyhow. Let's go to default. And there is everything, including the eggplant. All right, so let's think about the things that we don't like about this page. I mean, and forgetting the fact that it isn't designed, it's just thrown together and all that. You know, number one, if I want to insert something, I don't want to see the first thing on the list and then have to click new. If I want to insert, I just want to go into insert mode, right? So I don't like that. I don't like the fact that it displays a topping and I have to hit insert. Second thing I don't like, all right, is that when I click save, it just really doesn't seem to do anything. It just shows me the first topping again. Here's what I would like to have happen. Number one, I would like to, as soon as I go to that page, immediately I'm in insert mode without having to click new. Number two, I would like, when I'm done, to go and redirect to the list page. All right, because I went add my topping, I want to go back to the list and review the topping some more. So that's the two things we're going to do. The first one's easy, and the second one is also kind of easy, but it is going to bring in some new topics that we haven't talked about yet. All right, so on my Add Toppings page, I can click for Details View. There is a default mode, and default mode is read-only.
Read only.
What that does is that executes a select and shows you the values that it retrieved. I don't want that mode. I instead want the mode of inserting. So I'm going to go straight into insert mode. Notice what it did when I went into insert mode. It actually changed those from labels to text boxes. So now when I go to that page, immediately I'll be in insert mode. So that's half the battle. The second half of the battle, I sort of know what I want to do. I want to redirect to the list page, default.aspx. But where do I put that code? That's the question. Because this isn't like the other way. The framework's handling all the dirty work in this example. The framework is going out and doing the insert and filling in all the parameters and doing all that. So I don't have any code. I don't have any code to put a try-catch around. All right? And I don't have any code to put a redirect after. So what do? Well, there's some hooks built into the framework that if you use the framework, there are places to put code. And that's what we're going to look at. I'm going to look at, and I'm going to do this in source view. And this detail view, I'm going to start typing on. And you'll notice that the two relevant ones, or the two potentially relevant ones, are on item inserted and on item inserting. What do you think the difference between those two are? This is where your English class comes in handy. What's the difference between inserted and inserting? Yes?
One has already been inserted and the other one you are currently inserting.
Yeah, one's in the process of being inserted. One is, the insert is finished. All right, so where do we want to put the code here?
Inserting.
Well, do we want to redirect while it's inserting? No, we want to redirect after it's inserted.
Right.
Okay, so after it's inserted, we want to redirect. This will be the same place that we'll put the exception handling in a minute here. All right? So, I'm going to create on item inserted equals, and there I have a choice to do two things. I can create a new event, which I probably want to do, or I can tie it to code that I've already written. Well, I haven't written the code yet, so, and I don't want to do the page load event here. I want to do some new code. So I'm going to say create new event. And what that will do is in my CS file, it creates a new function. That's going to be details view ID item inserted. And it's tied to after an insert finishes on this details view. That's important to have that link because you can have the function in your code behind. But if that function isn't tied to the event of the insert finishing, then that function will never run. All right? So, we're going to go in here, and for now, all I'm going to say is when I'm done, response dot redirect to default.aspx. All right. So now let's see how this works. This should take care of the two problems that I wanted to address. One, it should pop immediately into insert mode. Two, it should go into the listing when I'm done inserting. I guess this is showing that even when you use the out-of-the-box functionality, in other words, when you let the components do the inserting and handle all that, there's still places for you to put custom code. Again, depending on how you want it And the reason that it's not all built into the framework is because a lot of it depends on the particular application and how you want to handle it. So some of these details, like what mode you want to go into when you first enter that page, or what you want to do when you're done inserting. There's hooks for you to do that, but you have to customize it to get it to do it the way you want to. So username, Mike, password. Go to this page. Boom, I'm in insert mode automatically. And I can go in and I can type what I want. Calories, kielbasa is very low calories, so I'll put 1 here. And I'm going to hit insert, and boom, there we are. It's added. Okay, so this is starting to work more like a application that makes sense and has a flow to it instead of just like random pieces that just work. I would then probably put a link on this page to add topping. In fact, I'm going to do that next. All right, and then we're in business. So let me go and do that. Probably should have did this from the start, but. Alright, and then I'm going to change the login to redirect to the default page. Just so we can see the flow. So I go here, log on. Can go to add a topping, insert, and I go back to that page. All right. So now we know a second way to do it. And again, it's up to you which works. What's good about this is when you're literally entering in all the fields manually, then you might as well use the out-of-the-box solution. When you have to do some functioning, I'm not 100% sure. You could probably still use this, but you'd have to write some more code. You'd have to probably write some code in the inserting event to go and grab the user ID from the session variable and stick it in the parameter and do that sort of thing. All right, but we won't worry about that, at least not right now. That's something I would like to try, maybe in next lecture or something, to do it that way. All right, what about error catching? All right, because I'm sure that we can't have duplicate topping name. We shouldn't be able to. All right, and secondly, it should be required. So I go to add topping. I go to insert. Boom! It blows up.
Yeah, boom.
But it doesn't tell us. Notice there's just nothing there.
Nope.
Doesn't give us an error.
No, not really.
Or if I type in a duplicate name, and insert, it also fails without giving us any sort of message. All right? Neither of those things are good. We would want to know that it failed. All right? Now, the required field, well, we'll address this in two pieces. First thing we're going to do is we're going to put some exception handling in this. And that should probably take us the rest of today's class. Next time we'll talk about doing validation. Because doing validation on this is harder than it looks. It's not hard, but we haven't done any of this sort of validation before. It's a little bit of a new concept. So, error trapping.
Right.
The problem here is we don't have any code to wrap our try-catch around. The error has already happened by the time it makes it to this line of code. Right? The error has already happened. We don't have an insert. The framework handles that. So, we can't wrap a try-catch around like we did in the other example. But, if we look closely, details view insert event arguments is what we're going to need to look at. Because those arguments are kind of like a report of what just happened.
Right.
All right? That object E contains a report of what happened. And one of the things in the report is going to be whether or not there was an error. Okay? Whether or not there was an error. So I'm going to go and put a label on this page so I can put the error message somewhere. And of course, I can't get to the toolbox. I'm going to put a label there, call it label error. Now, consider this to be, this E object to be the police report. This is what happened. So I have an if statement. If E dot exception. This report contains an exception object that may or may not be populated. There's a place to put an exception if an exception occurred. I'm going to check to see if it's null. If it's null, what does that mean? It means there was no exception. There's always a place to put an exception, but there might not be anything in it if there was no problem. So, if the exception equals null, then, guess what? We're okay. We can go to this other page. But if that exception isn't null, then we have a problem. And I can enter code in the label error, and I can say label error. Text equals error inserting, probable causes, and again I can put in what I think the probable causes are. I have to do one more thing. I have to say E dot exception handled equals true. If I don't put that in there, then the framework's going to think it needs to handle the exception.
Indeed.
And it's going to give us an ugly error like we saw before. So I'm telling the I'm telling the framework that I've handled that exception. You no longer have to worry about it. So let's try this, verify that it works, and call it a day.
I agree.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
For one thing, this computer reminds me, if you've ever seen the videos of the guys that are like passing out when they're at the end of a marathon. That's what this computer's doing. Like, I'm typing and like no characters are displaying on the screen, and I do this, and so something is not, computer's not feeling very well today. So I go in here, password. It thinks about it. I go to add topping. All right, I type in a duplicate name. Click insert. And I get the error message displaying there. And I don't get an ugly error message. Now, our cliffhanger for next week. What about if I put nothing in here? All right, and click insert. It's again going to tell me that I have an error, right? Because you have to have a topping name. But gee, that sure should be something we can validate for, because we have those validation controls. So duplicate item in the database we talked about before. There's no sort of built-in validation for that. But whether that there's a field, there's a value in a field, yeah, we should be able to validate for that. But it's not as easy as it looks. And we'll do that on Tuesday. Questions about this? All right, we'll see you in lab.
See you later.